Hello and welcome back to Building a High Capacity Board for PACE Center for Girls. My name is Nona Jones and I serve as Chief External Affairs Officer at PACE, and we're continuing our discussion with President and CEO of PACE, Mary Marx, as well as Boys and Girls Clubs of America President Emeritus Roxanne Spillett. So we're going to transition our discussion a little bit from board development to resource development, and we know that these two responsibilities certainly are hand in hand, but sometimes they do get siloed and put into committees to do. So Roxanne, if we could start with you, could you talk a little bit about the role that the entire board should play when it comes to securing resources?
Yeah. This is not about compartmentalizing resource development to the few, it's to all. And all the more reason that we need to connect our recruitment to people of influence, affluence, and access with fundraising. And the more connections your board has, the more potential there is for fundraising. But you know, I look at fundraising in a very simple way. I look at the role of the board in a very simple way. First of all, and I'll just mention this and put it aside, every board member needs to give, okay? And in reality, the kind of gift as a board member should be a sacrificial gift, and that may look different for different people, but it really is an expression of their deep commitment to the organization. But let me get to the fundraising part, everybody's part. So I'm reducing this to a very simple construct, which works for me. There are only 4 activities in fundraising. You have to identify the prospects, you have to cultivate the prospects, you have to solicit them, and then you have to steward them. And if you look around the table at the board, any board, you're going to need people who are going to extend the work of the staff and engage in fundraising. They're going to be asked to prospect. Somebody from the staff, the executive director, is going to meet with every board member and ask them who their contacts are, what their networks are, and would they be willing to open the door, not just identify, but open the door. So prospecting, board members who are engaged in this can also not just identify the prospects, open the door, and even be the person to prospect with other board members. So prospecting, every board member can do that, and every board member has prospects. The second activity, also very simple, is cultivate. And so cultivation is so important. It gives you a chance to get to know a donor, and it gives the donor or the board member a chance to know you. So cultivation, whether it's board development or resource development, is really important to get them to see a center, to get them to talk to girls, to take them to lunch, to have a party in your home. So all of these cultivation activities are a major role that a board member can play. And you know, the stature of the board member is a factor too, because if you're a board member and you're asking somebody to lunch, you know, that's a big compliment often to the person that's being invited. So board members can dive really deeply in cultivating these prospects that are identified in the first phase. And then the third area is solicitation. Now, every board member can solicit, but I would be less than truthful if I were to tell you that every board member loves to solicit. So there will be people, and in my experience, there has been, over many years, people who are wonderful at soliciting. And they're not shy, they know exactly what to do, they take some coaching from the executive director, they understand the challenge, and they're there and they ask for the gift. So solicitation, and again, I would recommend that that's a partnership between the staff and the board. So that's solicitation, and then the last area is stewardship. And I would tell you, and Mary, I know you know this, that stewardship is the weakest part of fundraising operations in nonprofits. Stewardship is about saying thank you to a donor. Stewardship is about really keeping a donor informed of the progress they're making and the impact of their gift, and just staying in touch with the donor. You know, donors don't like to give money and then never hear from you. It's like, get the money and run. That's not what we're about.
It's like that cousin that only shows up when they need something. You know?
Or for dinner.
Or for dinner,
Or for dinner, yeah. So this idea of stewardship, and I think there's a real valuable role for the board to play in thanking donors and communicating with them about the progress that's being made about inviting them as a guest to your special event. There's so much you can do as a board in stewardship. So just continue on the Colin Powell thing for a minute. So I was in a position where I was surprised by a donor. I had said something to the donor about the high school graduation rates, and he was the CEO of a big company, and he challenged me on the data. And I said, Jim, this data is fact check, I guarantee you. He said, come to my office tomorrow morning. And I did, and he said, I'm going to give you $5 million to fix the graduation price. Well, it's going to take a lot more than that, Jim. So very graciously, you know, it enabled us to start programs. It was wonderful. And so what can I do to express to this gentleman the power of his gift? Now, I wouldn't do this often, but I asked, you know, Colin Powell, can you call Jim and thank him? Done. And just that call, I mean, you can imagine what that would mean. And I'm not saying that, you know, this is impossible at a local level. There are people of stature in every community. You have your Colin Powells of every community. And if they're engaged and they thank people for their gifts and communicate with them, that goes a long, long way.
And I think that's a critical point, because if we look at the structure of our organization, the people on our local boards are the local leaders in their communities. It's the reason they're being recruited for the board. It's the reason they're on the board. And it's that role that they can play, not just in prospecting and identifying, but in cultivating and stewarding.
And stewarding, absolutely, Mary. I think, you know, and in reality, the board is an extension of the staff. It's like a partnership, but you can, and the board in a way is a force multiplier, because you're going to get so much more resource development done. Yes, you have to coordinate their work. Yes, you have to stay in touch with them, but they're going to score. You know, they're going to get gifts. They're going to thank people for gifts. They're going to identify potential donors. So I think if you think of fundraising as a full board activity, and you think of it as identification, cultivation, solicitation, and stewardship, there will be a big role for everybody, one that they'll feel comfortable with.
Oh, absolutely.
And the role of the development committee on the board then is sort of the coordination and organization of that process, but every single person on the board has a role to play and has a network that they can bring to the table.
Well, that's an excellent segue actually to my next question. I know the Board of Trustees has really transformed over the past couple years when it comes to their level of engagement with development. So can you talk a little bit about the role that they've started to play in the resource development process?
Well, they've played a large role in multiple venues. And first of all, they've played a very large role in the public sector in looking at the significant increase that we've had in public sector funding. And the role that they've played there through the relationships that they have with elected officials, but also through the relationships that they have with department heads in the system themselves. They've also played a very significant role in the private sector fundraising. So really helping to cultivate and look at leadership when there's large funders such as the Edna McConnell Clark Foundation. It's really important that they see leadership and evolution, so that there's been a partnership between me as the CEO and the board, particularly the board chair, in securing those large multi-million-dollar, multi-year gifts. And then finally, at their own level, recognizing the role that they can play not only in raising funds to support the organization as a whole, but also the role that they can play in finding resources to support centers, as well as the role that they can play in identifying, recruiting, and onboarding board members at the local level. So they've really changed their strategy and really have looked at setting significant goals for themselves in terms of the resources that they want to bring to the table, and then meeting and exceeding those goals on a regular basis.
And can you tell kind of the dollar amounts of those goals? Because I think I remember when I joined the Board of Trustees back in I think 2010, there really wasn't a goal. It was just give what you can, and you did, but it really got stepped up.
Well, in 2011, they decided to set their first goal, and I think they thought they were going to be really ambitious, and they set it for $150,000, and they exceeded that. The next year, $250,000, and then last year, $500,000, which they exceeded, and then this year, setting a stretch goal of $850,000 that the trustees are going to raise. I think, again, going back to the the other public sector and private sector funding too, though, having really had a significant role in that. Being able to increase our public sector funding by $4 million in 2 years, which was a very significant role that the trustees are also playing. And similarly looking at some of the other private sector and public sector funding, Anna McConnell Clark being one, and Social Innovation Fund being another.
Good point. Anything you wanted to add?
Yeah,
Nancy?
I do. We talked earlier in an earlier segment about this concept of family, how we're all part of a movement. And we have board members in different locations across the state of Florida. And there may be board members who have connections with potential board members or potential donors in other communities across the state. And I think we need to think about how we can surely focus on our center's goals and surely focus on our fundraising goals for the center. But are there some natural connections that we can make to help our brothers and sisters all over, I guess it's sisters, all over the state? And how do we do that? How do we create that kind of culture?
Sure.
Because while you may be helping somebody else out, I guarantee you there's going to be somebody out there who's going to help you out. And so when you create that culture, you just expand the horizons of the organization.
And you're right, it has to be a culture and
Yeah.
not just an action. It has to really infiltrate every aspect of the work that we do.
And that's part of Vision 2020, is really recognizing that organically we really are moving from being an organization that was very place-based to really being an organization that's really around how do you fundamentally change conditions for girls. It isn't, you can't just provide service, you also need to be able to change those policies that will impact all girls, as well as being able to change the systems and generate the support that's going to sustain that.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, because while we have a center and while that's our focus, we're advocates.
Absolutely.
Advocates not just in our community, not just in our state, but we're advocates for girls.
Well, and as we talk about advocating for girls, I think that's a kind of natural bridge to talk about the art of the ask, because in many ways that's kind of the most uncomfortable piece of the development process for many board members. So what do you think the staff can maybe do and the board can maybe do to ease the hesitation around asking?
So just let me give this a context, so we're all talking about the same thing. Asks are done in many ways. There are asks that are done by letter. There are asks that are done by phone calls. There are asks that are done by face-to-face conversation. Bar none, face-to-face fundraising is going to be your most effective. So when we talk about the art of the ask, let's focus on the face-to-face fundraising. And, I believe I've seen this happen so many times, how important it is to be face-to-face with a donor. You can't really hear their voices or, express your passion as effectively in a phone call or a letter. So face-to-face is the way to go. And I think this is not something that people are, for the most part, really excited about. And so what you have to remember, and it's very important that you say this to yourself, that I am not raising money for me. Me is not what's important here. It's the girls.
Right.
It's about the girls. That's why I'm doing this. I believe in it deeply.
Right.
And I know people who have capacity. And I want to tell them the story. And I want them to come with me on the journey. So I think it's really important to understand that while you may feel like this is intrusive or you may feel uncomfortable, it's about the girls. It's about the mission.
And I think when you ask donors why they give and why they get involved, to them it's an honor to be able to support, because it is about the girls.
Yeah.
They want to make a significant difference,
Yeah.
and they want to be invited to ask. They want to be invited to participate.
That's a great point.
And they want to know they're making a difference.
That's a great point. Sure.
So this idea of mindset is really important. We have to understand why we're doing this and who benefits. And I think that kind of takes the edge off for the most part. But, asking too, involves cultivation.
Yeah.
And again, I use the analogy about getting married on the first date when it comes to recruiting board members. You know, you don't want to sit face to face with a donor who really knows nothing about PACE
Right.
and then suddenly ask for the big gift. You know, this is kind of not going to, not the recipe for success. So there is a process of cultivation for donors. It mirrors in many ways the process of cultivation for board members. So we talked about the role that board members can play. Cultivating board members before the ask is really important. And we should know something about them. We should know something about what the research says about what their business is, what their interests are, where their philanthropy goes, what size gifts do they make. All of that is part of, you know, gathering knowledge, and the cultivation process gives you the opportunity to interact, and it's gaining valuable information for you about what should the ask be, what size ask, what is a compelling case that we should stress in making the ask. So cultivation is really important. Now, I know we're not at the ask yet, but if you don't have the right mindset and you're not, you know, serious about cultivation, you will be less successful in the face-to-face fundraising. So you have to have the right ask. You have to figure out what is the right ask. And you know, you can wring your hands about, is this right? But directionally, you will discover through your interaction with them and through your research what really makes sense. And then comes the point where you ask. And so you're not going to knock on the door and they're not going to say, PACE who? What's that? You know,
Right.
They're going to expect, you know, that they're, and you know, the bait and switch thing doesn't work. You know, I think when you ask for a meeting, you have to be clear. I know you've been involved with PACE. I know you know. I want to tell you a little bit more about it and talk to you about ways that you can support PACE. And so don't surprise them and tell them you're coming to talk to them about something different. I think you have to, you know, be upfront about that. But the board, you know, if it's a face-to-face ask, the board, I think, can play an extraordinarily valuable role. I think the executive director is a great partner, and that we should look at this as a partnership as well.
Right.
Often the level of detail that a prospective donor may ask for is something that the executive director is intimately familiar with and could add enormous value on that call. So again, we're talking about a board and staff partnership, and the executive director and the development staff are key to making this happen. So you know, you're at a point where you're face-to-face with a donor, and there's kind of a, you know, a logic to how you proceed. There's the niceties and the friendship that, you know, bring you together and really take the edge off the meeting. And then there's the, you know, there's the clear statement, we're here to talk to you today about something that is critically important to our girls, to our community, to our country, and we'd like you to be a part of it. And so, you know, you ground the prospective donor in the fact that they're going to be asked for something. Some people lead with the amount, some people close with the amount and then have a discussion. I mean, I think that's a personal preference kind of thing. I personally don't lead with the size of the ask. I'd rather
$300,000 from
yeah,
you. Yeah.
yeah. So, so this idea that you describe, now remember, they know the case for PACE. They've been involved, they've been cultivated.
Yeah.
But you have to describe this compelling gift opportunity as an opportunity for them to make a difference, the likes of which, you know, are unparalleled in philanthropy in our center, or if you're asking for a really big gift, the biggest gift. So you have to make it grounded in its true importance and talk about its outcomes, less about the process and more about the outcomes. You know, we live in a world today where the so what question, we can talk all we want about PACE and or Boys and Girls Clubs, its facilities, its programs, but ultimately you have to answer the so what question.
That's right.
What are the outcomes? And PACE is on a great trajectory with their theory of change and their outcome measures and their evaluation, and they're well poised to be very articulate about this question, so the donor knows not only will their investment create activity, but the activity will create a result, a measurable result. So I think describing the ask is really important, and then pausing and asking them what they think And you know, you can't make a call like this without engaging the donor in conversation. So you have to be mindful that this isn't, you know, this isn't all about what you say or what you and your board members say. You have to leave time to hear from the donor. And then you make the ask and you pause again. And, you know, you listen to what the donor says. And I would say the same thing we said about board members. I would never leave a meeting with the door closed. You know, so this might not be right for now. This might not be right for another year, but we'd like to come back and tell you about what's happened and where you can be of help to us. So I would never close the door, but I would also offer this, that most of the time, if you're asking for a big gift, you're probably not going to get an answer on the spot.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So the question that you need to ask is, what else can, you know, what are your questions? How can we, you know, help you, you know,
In your
answer those
decision-making.
questions? And so don't expect the ask to produce a result at that moment on that day. Although it happens, it's happened to me. It's great when it happens, but
Sure.
you know, don't bank on it. And you know, often you don't get a hard no. Either often you get, well, I want to talk to my family about this. I want to think about this, and then you offer the follow-up information, and you know, then you follow up.
And I think what's important about that conversation is also in the evolution of PACE, and again going back to the funding model that we really are public-private, with the majority of our funding really being from the public sector, that we're revolving now. And in many cases we have insufficient development staff, but you can still do some of the research. And even if the ask is for a smaller gift, that it's really important you understand your donor, you understand what their interests are, and you have the right people making the ask.
Yes.
That it is that peer-to-peer conversation
Yes.
that's comfortable for
Excellent.
the donor, but that the staff person there is there to provide the detail for the questions that are asked.
Well, and I think really coloring the whole process is what you both articulated earlier, is the fact that you have to remember why you're there and understand that it's for the girls and it's about serving them in new ways and better ways, or serving more of them. And so one thing that popped in my mind is a question for you, Mary, then is, you know, as you're having conversations with very major donors about investing in PACE, you know, what's the story that you're telling them to get them thinking about investing in PACE?
And it goes back to what Roxanne said about knowing your donor. It really is about the cultivation process and understanding what interests them. In some cases, it really is about making sure that they've been introduced to a girl. They've got a face and a story, and somebody that when they're thinking about making their gift, they've got her in their mind. In other cases, you've got donors who really are all about the data. I want to know what are the outcomes. I want to know, you know, in the long term, what are the outcomes. And in some cases, your donor wants both. So it's really being able to understand how to tell the story to them. That's going to resonate with them.
You know, just to that point, I worked with a donor for many years, very, very wealthy and generous donor. And, you know, he funded a couple of programs to start. And when we'd ask him, you know, for a follow-up gift, you know, he kind of hesitated. He said, I'm not really getting the satisfaction I'm looking for personally from this gift. And of course the question then becomes, well, what would, you know, what would really lead to your fulfillment, you know, for making these generous investments? He said, I want to start clubs. I want to start clubs in the poorest communities in the country. And I want to be the donor that's the last donor in. I mean, he was very specific. So I never had to, you know, worry. I never even had to check in with him about his interest, because I would check in with him and I'd say, listen, in Compton area outside of Los Angeles, we need a club there. We're ready to build. I just want to alert you. He said, count me in for the last dollar. I mean, it was that simple.
Wow.
And he would fund these things in Benton Harbor. I called him. I was just in Benton Harbor, and this community needs so much help. They want to start a Boys and Girls Club. He said, count on me. He made the investment sight unseen.
Wow.
So, you know, if you really know your donor and they really know you and there's trust there, those things happen.
And I think that trust is really critical.
Yeah.
So that speaks to the follow-up, the stewardship, the
Yeah,
cultivation as
exactly.
well, because they need to know that the investment that they're making is being used wisely and that it is making a difference, and that's why they're there.
Well, and I would say as we kind of round out this discussion that the stewardship process is a role that the board definitely can play and definitely can assist the executive director and the development directors with, because that is, like you said, the piece that's often left undone, but that's the piece that actually really ties everything together. And we certainly don't want fallout from donors because we never contacted them, thanked them, told them what their impact
Well, and
is.
it's also, if you think about the board are the ones who are most likely to
Absolutely.
be engaging with the donor in
Everyday
other
life.
venues,
Yeah.
and to really, again, thank them whenever they see them and remind them of what their gift is providing.
Anything else you all would like to add before we end this segment? Because I think we've had another rich discussion, so good.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, with that, we're going to round out this segment, and we're going to slide into our final segment, which you are not going to want to miss, because we're going to be talking about the key components of the compelling case that Roxanne alluded to earlier for why people should partner with PACE in order to serve girls. Stay tuned.